Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Don and Alexis joining you here today on another episode. Today we're going to be going, Alexis is here, so you probably have already guessed it. Who's going to be involved in the podcast today, Alexis?
England.
Who'd have thunk it? But this actually covers more of European history and does have a pretty broad scope. It definitely ties back to England, but our topic today is not going to be focused just on England. In fact, the person we're going to be focused on actually is from the continent proper, not actually from the bejeweled isle. Who are we going to be focusing on today?
Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Eleanor of Aquitaine. And one of the ways that I know you're a powerful force in history is if Katharine Hepburn has played you in a movie, then you probably qualify as being a powerful force in history. And many of you probably are very familiar with Hepburn's performance in The Lion in Winter, where she plays Eleanor actually opposite Peter O'Toole. So there's actually quite a tour de force there in terms of talents relating to that stage play that was then converted and done in a movie in the late 60s. But Eleanor's a pretty interesting character, wouldn't you agree, Alexis?
Definitely.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk today, though, about the particular fork in time where Eleanor, who eventually becomes Queen of England, never becomes Queen of England.
Correct.
And so we will talk a little bit about what that is and how that might work after this word from one of our affiliates. We'll be right back. Taking a quick break here from the podcast. This is Don along with
Alexis.
And today we just want to talk very briefly about an opportunity that is both for you and for us. And that's an opportunity if you've been thinking about starting a podcast, like we were thinking about starting a podcast actually for a couple of years before we did it.
Yeah, this was a long road.
Yeah, and we've really enjoyed for the last half years we've done it. When we got to the point of starting the podcast, I'd been a long-time podcast listener, as had Alexis. Alexis, what did you know about actually hosting a podcast?
Not much.
I knew at least that much, or maybe a little bit less. And so I began to do some research. And again, I'd been a podcast listener for a number of years, but as I started doing research, more and more I found myself gravitating towards where we host Fork in Time, and that's Buzzsprout. What would you say our experience with Buzzsprout has been so far, Alex?
Very user-friendly.
Incredibly user-friendly, incredibly intuitive. In fact, as I was going through setting up the podcast, which I did in a matter of probably about an hour total when I first set it up, it helped me, for example, get things set up so that I could upload audio, gave me suggestions for about how to record audio and how to edit audio, but it also went ahead and gave suggestions on how to get into all of the popular podcast search directories. So I didn't know how to get the podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, but guess who does?
Buzzsprout does.
Buzzsprout does. And I think that's among many other reasons why over 100,000 podcasts actually call Buzzsprout home. So what is the deal that we have that allow us to benefit, but also allow someone who may be listening to our shows think about starting a podcast? What benefit do they get, Lex, if they go to Buzzsprout?
So if you go to our show notes, there's a link to Buzzsprout in those show notes. If you click on that, and if you decide you want to start in this podcast venture, we don't call you competition, just welcome to the podcasting family. But if you decide you want to start a podcast and you click on that link in our show notes, you actually get a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan with Buzzsprout. And because you clicked on that link, Buzzsprout knows that we sent you there, so we actually get a little bit of a benefit as well. That's what we in the business call a what?
I think it's called a win-win.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, it's a win-win. And so again, among the things that Buzzsprout provides is not just a place to host a podcast, not just a place to do the uploading, but a web page for your podcast. Players you can embed inside of a website, or they can be standalone. Basically, it's a turnkey solution to someone who's looking to start a podcast. That's how I found it to be. We can speak personally because we use Buzzsprout, and we would recommend if you've been thinking about going down the podcast avenue that you look at them too, and again, join the group of over 100,000 podcasts that have found Buzzsprout to be a great place to call home. So again, Alexis, how do they take advantage of the offer?
Go to the show notes, click on the Buzzsprout link, and then if you want to start your podcast, just follow that link, and you'll get that $20 Amazon gift card with your paid membership to Buzzsprout. And then because we sent you there, we'll get a little thing too.
All right, great. Again, if you've been thinking about it, I would encourage you to do it. It's been something that we've enjoyed, and I think you will too. Thanks.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, where we are talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine. So we're in England, but not really.
In fact, as we take the fork, we'll find that we're not actually in England. So, again, give you a little more background on who Eleanor was and what Aquitaine is, Lex. So help our listeners who may not be familiar with this particular period of history or that particular region, who we're talking about and where she hails from.
Sure. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, she is the daughter of William X, who is the Duke of Aquitaine. And if you're not familiar where Aquitaine is, it is in the southwest region of France. So, as one of the other podcasts I listen to a lot, they call that the left of France, which as we go forward, you'll see why we call it the left of France.
And so what makes Eleanor such an attractive bride?
Well, of course, she's a woman in that time period, so that's important. But also because Aquitaine is a very rich province in terms of the amount of land that is in Aquitaine and the amount of fertile land that it is. It's forested pretty heavily, and it's very good farmland. So because of that, you have things like, of course, grapes. The town of Bordeaux is in Aquitaine, if you're familiar with Bordeaux, and wine, walnuts, things like that. So a lot of things are able to prosper and grow, and actually are able to then trade throughout the region from Aquitaine. So that's one of the reasons why it's such a significant duchy for her to be the heiress of.
Okay, and in the real timeline, she eventually, as we've talked about before, ends up being married to Henry of England, who becomes Henry II.
Mm-hmm.
And we probably will talk about, as we talk about the historical what-ifs here, some of their offspring in the real timeline, because we'll be talking about negating them in terms of history. But Henry,
and they're familiar names. When we get to them, you'll recognize them.
Yeah, but Henry is not Eleanor's first husband.
No, Henry is not Eleanor's first husband. She is first married to Louis VII of France. And it's important to recognize, of course, we're talking about Aquitaine, which is in France. The Duke of Aquitaine actually held more land than the actual King of France himself. So we're talking about a very powerful duchy of Aquitaine. So her first husband is Louis VII, the King of France.
Okay, and how does she end up with Louis?
Through a dynastic match. Her father thinks that this will be a very advantageous marriage, so he sets it up, but it doesn't last very long.
Okay, as I understand the history too, she was going to be the sole heiress of Aquitaine.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I was interested to learn as I was doing some of the research here, since I have to do research on topics like this because I don't know them off the top of my head like Alexis does, is that it was not uncommon to sort of basically just kidnap women of prominence who had lands and kidnap them and carry off and marry them. And so actually Eleanor's father had some concern that this would be Eleanor's fate once he died.
Correct.
And she was a teenager at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was actually given over to the King of France, the present King of France at that time, to be her
kind of a ward,
guardian, protector. And he decided the best way to protect her was to do what?
Marry her. Marry to his son.
Yes. And in the process, what does he pick up?
A lot of land.
He picks up a lot of land. So the best way I can protect you is by protecting the interest of my family line as well. I guess the other interesting thing was, I guess it had been agreed or arranged or was part of the custom of the day, was that whoever married her would not directly take possession of the land, but obviously it would be the heirs that she bore who would actually be able to inherit the land. So she was the key to getting the land, but if you married her, you didn't get the land, you just got the right that your kids were going to have it. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Pretty much, yeah. It was kind of a dowry or a pre-contract. It was kind of that the paperwork you would sign as part of the marriage agreement, and part of it was, okay, you're almost the custodian of the land. The people who are actually going to inherit the land are our kids, so you're just holding it for them.
Okay, so the period of time that we're talking about here, most approximate date of Eleanor's birth, based upon some records that are around 1122, give or take.
Roughly, yeah.
And she becomes the Queen Consort of France in 1137. So she is all of 15 years old, perhaps, when that happens?
Yes.
And so that's when she marries the Louis that you mentioned, who is Louis VII.
That is also the year her father dies.
Correct. And so she loses her father, she gains a protector, and she quickly gains a husband as a result of her protector. And so now she's the Queen Consort of France, and she and Louis do have children, correct?
They do. They have 2 daughters. Notice I said daughters.
Daughters. And so what is the ultimate fate of their marriage?
The ultimate fate of their marriage is it is annulled, meaning it is almost it's behaved like it never even happened. Even though they have 2 kids from the marriage is annulled in 1152, and Eleanor quickly moves on.
Okay, so it's not a short marriage either. We mentioned that she was married in 1137. The annulment happens in 1152, so 15 years or so of marriage. 2 daughters are produced from the marriage. The first of those is
Marie,
and the second of those is
Alex.
So obviously this is not uncommon. We've seen this. We've talked about this in other podcast episodes, mainly normally around Henry VIII and others. Yeah. But the key was to have male heirs, because that's normally how the throne was passed, was through a male heir. And so with the absence of a male heir, Louis decides to set her aside to annul the marriage because they have not had a son.
Correct, yeah. We have talked about this before, you're right. Specifically with Henry VIII, the girls don't really count in terms of counting offspring when it comes to marriages and dissolving marriages. So because they only have those 2 daughters, no sons, it's quite easy for Louis to set Eleanor aside and to marry somebody else.
Okay, and my understanding of the rationale behind the annulment was that they were too closely related to be married, which is, to me, incredibly ironic from what I know about European marriage among royalty, is that, cousins get married all the time. And
well, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. Henry was just as related to Eleanor as Louis was.
In fact, even more so. But that is the official stated reason by which their marriage should be annulled. Yeah. Is they never should have been allowed to marry in the first place because they were
too closely related.
So that's the stipulation that's granted by the papacy to allow the annulment. Now, as I understand it, the 2 girls were still considered to be legitimate, and so provisions were made for them. In fact, I guess Marie ultimately becomes the Countess of Champagne, and the daughter, Alex, becomes a countess as well. But we're not going to be talking about this real timeline again.
Correct.
What we do on A Fork in Time is talk about alternate history. And so in the real timeline, she goes on to marry Henry. They go on to have 8 kids, 5 sons. Some of their sons include who would people know that are descendants of Henry and Eleanor?
Well, there's this one called Richard I. There's another one called John. So some pretty familiar names that come out of that union between Henry and Eleanor.
Right, and Henry was actually quite prolific and well known during his reign as the King of England. Now, what does happen as a result of Eleanor's marriage to Henry, only 8 weeks after her annulment.
Yeah, it was real quick.
To the King of France, is so she moves from being the Queen Consort of France. Now, when she marries Henry, he is not yet.
Not yet, no.
He's
not yet King of England.
Right, but she will become Queen of England as a result of that. But it's only 8 weeks after her annulment to the marriage to the King of France, to Louis. And so what is one of the ultimate consequences of Eleanor's second marriage?
That'd be this little thing called the 100 Years' War.
The 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War is fought between which 2 countries?
France and England.
And it's fought mainly over what?
Territory. And it's a misnomer. It's actually 119 years long, but that doesn't roll off the tongue as well as 100 Years' War, so it's quite a little span of time there.
Yeah, and the conflict ran from being hot and colder at various times, but it lasts for more than a century, and it's the ongoing struggle between England and France for who's going to control territory on the continent. At various points, I know in England and France's history, we've talked about this before, each of them sort of can maybe make a claim towards being the king of the other.
Yep.
And so it's they're closely related, but they're at war for a long period of time over this. And one of the precipitating factors of what eventually becomes the conflict here is the fact that England is going to gain control of not only the territories that they already had on the continent in western, what we think of today as modern France, but also the acquisition and the gain of Aquitaine as territory as well.
Yep, they're going to keep gaining more territory.
Right. So the way we're going to break things off here for the fork in time is one of the ways that you have Eleanor never married to Henry is that she stays married to Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very easy thing to imagine that there would have been no need for an annulment if just one simple thing had happened. What?
That'd be a boy?
Yeah, a boy. Is if Marie or Alex had been a boy producing a male heir to the French throne through Eleanor, it's highly unlikely that Louis would have sought the annulment. With no annulment, she's not Helen of Troy by any stretch here, although most of the accounts say that she is a very attractive woman.
Yeah.
But she would have remained Queen of France, and things would have been different. So that's where we're actually going to take the break today. That's going to be our fork, is that we're going to assume that their first child, Marie, is actually a boy. Now, we haven't talked about this before even recording here, Alexis, so do we want to assign an imaginary, I guess we're going to call him Louis the Eighth?
Even though there really is a Louis VIII, but...
Right. So this is going to assume that there's a Louis VIII that is the progeny
of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine?
Yeah, so that's where we're going to pick things up from there as we get ready to go down this alternate timeline. So assuming that happens, and assuming that happens about the time that Marie was born, what's the situation as things stand at that time in England regarding the throne?
So in England at that time, when Eleanor is actually a very young girl, we're in the midst of what they call in England the anarchy. So the future Henry II, his parents are actually Matilda and Geoffrey V, the Duke of Anjou. So Matilda is the legitimate daughter of Henry I. Go back to that episode we did on the White Ship. We talk about her a lot. So while Eleanor is growing up in France, we have this very turbulent time in England as Matilda is fighting for her throne against her cousin Stephen. And eventually, Matilda and Stephen come to this agreement where Stephen will not have his heirs. He does have a son who actually dies. But will not have his heirs take over the throne after him. Instead, Matilda's son, the future Henry II, will become the King of England after Stephen dies.
So, before we start talking about the impact of no Henry-Eleanor marriage on England, let's stick with the things that would have been different in France. So what is Louis's reign sort of known for in history?
He's not a very liked king. He is kind of a recluse, kind of a hermit, as opposed to his wife, who is very lively. Eleanor is a very lively person, so he's a little bit of a... He's not the most popular king in France.
But we do have actually an interesting thing. In fact, this does pertain to Eleanor. Again, she's the queen consort of France for 15 years before the annulment here. And so during part of that time, she's not in France. Where does she go?
She goes on crusade.
Yeah, so actually the Second Crusade, remember the Crusades are the efforts that were organized to go back and reclaim portions of the Holy Land for Christendom. So she actually leads out in one of the Crusades with, I guess, the armies from France and, of course, the others that came from Europe. So she actually is a crusader.
She absolutely is. And it's actually... that is one of the reasons that kind of leads to the downfall of their marriage. Is in the Second Crusade, she is there. And one of the things that was a big part of the Second Crusade was the fall of Damascus, the siege of Damascus. So Eleanor has some vested family interests in Jerusalem, and Louis, her husband, decides he's going to go over to Antioch. He's going to escape Jerusalem, going to go over to Antioch without Eleanor knowing about it. And so he diverts some troops as well. And that doesn't make Eleanor very, very happy. And he also ends up losing the siege that he decides to go on, and decides to subsequently just go back to France and kind of abandon the whole crusade idea, which again doesn't make Eleanor a very happy camper.
Right. And so as you and I were talking about off podcast, one of the reasons for the annulment is obviously the fact that no son has been produced in 15 years of marriage, but it also follows these events, which are in the late 1140s. I think 1147, 48 is the time of this crusade. So a few years after they're back from that crusade is when, in addition to the fact that there's been no male heir, it's these other tensions that have arisen that sort of came as a result of what happened while they were on crusade and other splits that are happening in the relationship and in the kingdom.
Yes.
Although at this point in our alternate timeline, we assume that there is now a
little boy?
Well, actually, or a young teenage male heir for France.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I want to jump to here is actually this is a good place maybe to jump back over to how things worked in the real timeline, maybe to inform our alternate timeline. Ultimately, she does have sons in the real timeline with Henry.
Yep.
And
5 of them, actually.
Yeah, and we mentioned some of those sons, who they were. How influential was she in the lives of her real timeline sons?
She was a mama bear. Her sons were very loyal to her, and she was not afraid to go to war for them, even against their own father. Right. So she was very fiercely protective of her sons.
So one of the things that we might consider in our alternate timeline is if she has coming back, and maybe there's been again conflict in the relationship and how they see things between her and Louis as a result of what happened during the Crusades, comes back and she now they have a young teenage heir apparent. I guess the French heir apparent is called the Dauphin. The Dauphin. So the Dauphin, in the form of Louis, the person that will be Louis VIII. Let's just assume that the relationship, she's going to be who she is, right? So,
yeah.
So that Louis VIII, the male version of Marie, is more along the mold, perhaps, of maybe a Richard that she actually had in her real marriage with Henry, and she's the type of person that has influence on him. So, what are some of the? I can think of a couple things in my head, and I'll be happy to share. What are some things in your head that might happen with with maybe a little conflict inside of the royal house of France?
I can totally see much in what happened in the real timeline with her kids with Henry. I can totally see if there's conflict with her and Louis, but she's got this son. She comes that fierce mama bear protector and says, I have all the influence over my son. You don't get to have influence over him. And she kind of dominates that son and kind of forces her perspective onto French politics in much the same way that she forced her perspective onto English politics in the real timeline.
Yeah, so we were assuming here that Eleanor is Eleanor, whether she's Queen of France or whether she's Queen of England.
That doesn't change.
Right. And so under that scenario, you may have a Louis VIII. You mentioned there was a real Louis VIII. I know nothing about him. I will confess readily right now. I didn't even research that. But the Louis VIII that we're talking about may have been much more of the temperament of perhaps
an Eleanor,
a Richard in the real timeline, who is actually goes by a particular nickname,
the Lionheart,
Lionhearted,
or Coeur de Lion, France.
Yeah. So imagine now you have a French version of Richard the Lionhearted because of the influence that Eleanor has over her French son.
Not a big leap at all.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that, again, it's looking at the real timeline of history maybe to inform the alternate timeline of history. Of course, one of the other major changes is this territory, this rich territory that we've talked about, Aquitaine, is not part of the possessions of the territories of England, but it's part of the territories of possession of France. And so I know one of the issues that came to blows, I guess, later with Louis is the resources that he had to undertake some of the things that he wanted to do. And part of the reason he didn't have as many resources as he could have had was he no longer had access to
Aquitaine.
And so one of the impacts in the alternate timeline where he does have now a male heir, whether he's influencing that heir or whether she's influencing that heir, is he still has access to the economic benefits and the other benefits of actually having Aquitaine be a territory that is directly controlled by France, and the Dauphin, Louis VIII, is going to inherit and definitely incorporating to being part of France.
Absolutely.
Now, Aquitaine is not the only possession on the continent that England has.
No.
What else do they have?
So they have Normandy. If you'll remember, William the Conqueror, William I of England, was the Duke of Normandy. So they still hold that duchy as kings of England. They are still the Duke of Normandy. They also hold Brittany as well. So they do have territories in France. They just wouldn't have Aquitaine.
And we mentioned that one of the things that happens now, it's several centuries down the road to get to the 100 Years' War, but there's been this constant struggle and battle and contest that's gone on between England and France over control of continental areas in France. This goes on for
hundreds of years.
In fact, in my mind, it's the backdrop of everything that's sort of going on, what seems like for the rest of English and French history.
Pretty much.
Yeah, at various points, even when they've been allies, that's been an element of tension between them. And so one of the things that does happen eventually, what leads to the 100 Years' War, is the fact that Aquitaine, in addition to the territories that we know as Normandy and Brittany, were English controlled.
Correct.
So if they had been part of France all along, back from where Eleanor was, are we saying that there wouldn't have been a 100 Years' War, or what are we saying?
I think there would have been a different 100 Years' War. I don't think it's likely that that England would have not invaded France at all. I think they would have at some point. That's kind of the nature of European countries at that point. They're always kind of fighting for territory and fighting for the upper hand. But you wouldn't have had this kind of in the background, and kind of the backdrop of the 100 Years' War is, we're not going to take this, we're just going to take it back. It's always been ours, we're just taking it back. But if we have this Dauphin, this Louis VIII, that's the product of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, he naturally gets the progression of Aquitaine in those lands. They never pass over to England because that marriage to Henry II never happens. So you wouldn't have this, that's just mine and I'm just taking it back. It's, I want it, I'm going to go take it.
Right. And of course, you mentioned before that the Duchy of Aquitaine had as much territory to it as all of the rest of France. So you immediately sort of double or more
Yes.
the size of France proper, if you will, under Louis VIII, assuming that he's able to succeed to that. And in fact, I'm looking here really quick because I don't remember exactly when it happened, but Louis VII lives a pretty long life. He lives another 30-ish years, almost 30 years after the annulment, and of course he does remarry, and he ultimately has male offspring as well. But he was not necessarily in good health for part of that, is what I understand, and so there could have been a situation where he might have passed the throne over earlier, or certainly would have had a more influential son who was ready to take the reins and do what needed to be done to protect the land that was ultimately going to be, because it wasn't Louis VII's, it was going to be Louis VIII.
Right, yeah, it was never Louis VII. Again, he was just kind of holding it until his son was old enough to get it. So if we're going with that, Louis VIII would eventually get that land. I think that would have been totally fine. And there actually is some precedent for kind of a king handing over power early, or kind of sharing power, so to speak. It actually happens with Henry II and his son by Eleanor, also named Henry. He's actually termed the young king. So I could totally see Louis VII, because he was kind of in that ill health, if he has that son with Eleanor of Aquitaine, him kind of sharing power and kind of him prepping his son to be king when eventually he would succeed.
Or giving him the authority as the, what would he have been for Aquitaine? The Duke of Aquitaine. And so as he comes of age, he assumes the role of being Duke of Aquitaine, and maybe
it's a practice realm for him, so to speak.
Right, and maybe he chooses to engage in military action against Brittany or Normandy,
possibly
from that perspective on behalf of France. And so the other possibility is we may ultimately end up with what we think of as the 100 Years' War, but we end up with it earlier in a different format, and obviously a stronger France in the equation. And my understanding of that war and just that whole period of time is that at various times England is on the ascension, France is ascending at times. I mean, it becomes almost a balance of power. It's a stalemate to some degree. In fact, the episode that's most recent to this in the podcast is we talk about the fact that the English Channel the geography of the English Channel really impacts how this war is. It's England fighting for territory across the Channel. You really don't see, for the most part, French troops or French activity on the
English side now.
Correct. That's just the nature of how things play out. So if we don't have, that's sort of now imagining, if you will, transplanting what we know about Eleanor's true heirs in the real timeline off on, and making them, again,
making them French heirs.
Yeah, where we sort of have this Louis VIII, Richard I kind of hybrid thing going on. But that also means that Henry doesn't have Eleanor to marry, doesn't have Aquitaine to gain.
Correct.
As we talked about before, he does obviously become the King of England, most likely.
Yeah.
But what do things look like, or what are the possibilities for other marriages, or how that plays out if there's no Eleanor?
So if there's no Eleanor, he does become king. Of course, we talked about the treaty between Matilda, his mother, and Stephen, his uncle. So I think you might have seen Henry marrying possibly a daughter of Stephen, or a daughter of a previous, somewhere in the family. If it's a granddaughter of William I, or if it's a daughter of Stephen, somebody within the family to kind of mend the peace and keep the peace, so to speak. I think that's a big possibility. My question there is does that then breed this kind of infighting? If, say, Henry II, right before he becomes Henry II, but say he does marry Stephen's daughter, do we have another grandson of William I coming and saying, wait a minute, what about my heirs? Or something like that. Do we have kind of this infighting starting maybe if he's marrying one of the family between the other members of the family? Like, wait, you didn't show me the honor that you're showing them. And he kind of has to do this balance of power internally.
So how does that ultimately play out long term?
I think ultimately you would have seen, we talk about that period between Matilda and Stephen being called the Anarchy because it's this series of civil wars. I think you might have seen this Anarchy Part 2 when you're talking about kind of the heirs of Stephen and kind of that it's still not quite settled. I mean, yeah, we had this treaty and yeah, this kind of, but then it kind of gets muddled again and people aren't quite happy with the results. Because, and especially because Henry hasn't gone outside of England to kind of bring in this other power and kind of bring in this stabilizing force. It's just kind of this whirlwind that kind of keeps going. So I actually want to switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the heirs of Henry and this supposed English wife instead of Eleanor, because of course Eleanor's still in France, married to Louis VII.
Okay.
So I think, obviously, the goal is to have sons. That's kind of the whole point of marrying when you're a king. So it's possible that you might have had a son named Richard, you might have had a son named John, but I don't think they would have had the same personalities as the person who became Richard I, the person who became King John, because I think it's definitely true that you are a product of your parents, and I think those two sons in particular were a product of Henry, of course, but definitely also a product of Eleanor. So if you have these two boys with Henry and, let's call her Mary, his wife Mary, not having these personalities of the real Richard I and King John, do we have a crusade? Do we have a crusading king coming from England? Probably not. Henry II was not a crusading king. He was focused on things in terms of civil reforms and things like that. Not really interested in religious conflict. Richard definitely gets that again from Eleanor, so I don't think you would have seen a crusader coming out of England. I also think that you might not have needed this little thing called the Magna Carta eventually.
And the Magna Carta comes from eventually Richard is king, but then John becomes king.
Correct, yeah.
And so it's there's a whole podcast episode on this before.
Yep.
And it's obviously an important thing. So the Magna Carta is signed between King John and the nobles of England. Mm-hmm. We talk about it in Western democratic tradition, particularly those of us that descend from an English tradition here in the United States, as being sort of a fundamental constitutional or fundamental document in terms of establishing rights, initially to nobles that eventually were extended beyond that. But it's a fair thing to say that after King John, the absolute monarchs of England are a little bit less absolute, right?
A little less absolute, and I think it's interesting to think about, especially it's kind of ironic in the sense that we're talking in this instance about not marrying into France. If you have no need for a document like the Magna Carta, which essentially does make absolute monarchy less absolute, do you have this situation in England where the monarchs become more and more and more absolute to the point that you have something like a French Revolution that's necessary to kind of bring them down a peg? They kind of get too big for the riches, too big for their boots. So it's interesting that we're talking about not marrying into France and kind of the heirs that would come from that, but because you have this marriage into France and because you have this figure named John who has to have this thing called the Magna Carta, kind of brings those checks into place, brings those checks and balances into place, so it kind of prevents the kind of anarchy, so to speak, that kind of reigns in other monarchies, including France.
So what you're saying is eventually the English monarchy may have looked more like the French monarchy in a different way, leading to a different way that's resolved there, and in some ways we've already talked about this, the French monarchy may have looked a little bit more like
the English monarchy,
as it turned out, because of the influence perhaps of Eleanor from Aquitaine,
yes,
on the sons that are there. Now, the other interesting thing about the actual the real timeline versus the proposed timeline is, Henry did something very interesting with the children that he or planned to do something very interesting with the children that he had actually with Eleanor. What was that?
Yeah, so he had 5 sons. He had some daughters too, but he had 5 sons. And because he had all this territory that he was governing, he essentially was able to kind of parse it out between those sons. So he had, his oldest was named Henry. We talked about this a little bit previously. Henry was actually called the Young King. They actually did a coronation for him while Henry II was still alive, because he was kind of being set up to be the next king of England. He does die before Henry II, which is why we have Richard I, who was the next son in line. Richard I was actually in line to take over Aquitaine. He actually does take over Aquitaine. He becomes Duke of Aquitaine. Then we have Geoffrey. Geoffrey actually takes over Brittany, which of course is also in France. Then we have another son that actually also passes away. But then we have John. And John is actually termed Lackland. And the reason he's termed Lackland is because Henry II had run out of land to give to his sons.
He lacks land to pass on to John. Now, you mentioned one of the situations that was to happen. Who was going to get Aquitaine?
Richard I.
Right. So, and again, I know we keep bouncing back and forth between the real and the forked timeline. I hope the listeners are able to follow here. If Aquitaine is not in Henry's portfolio to distribute among his sons, whatever those sons are named or whoever's sons they are besides his own, he doesn't have the same option available to him because he doesn't have Aquitaine, which would have been very attractive for Richard to take and essentially have control over, but he doesn't have that.
Right. Essentially, what Aquitaine and these other territories are basically kind of just proxy kingdoms, so to speak. It's like, go try your hand at being king, not with the actual country, but with this duchy. Go try your hand at governance, kind of get a flavor for it. But if he doesn't have those holdings, you kind of just end up with these bored sons that have nothing to do, because they're not gonna, their king is still the king. They're not gonna be cabinet members. They're not gonna be prime ministers. They're not gonna be, hold positions of power. So they're kind of just sitting around, biding their time, waiting, and not having these places to kind of go and kind of practice what they're eventually gonna be doing.
Right. All right. So, have we missed anything? We probably missed all kinds of things big. Probably. But have we missed anything more that you had thought about as being an important part of what would be different?
I think we hit it all. It always strikes me, and I've said this point multiple times when we visit England, or in this case we visited France today, but it's so interesting to me how if this one little turn happens, you possibly don't have those people that are so synonymous with English history, with history in general, so synonymous they get movies made about them. If we don't have Henry II marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, there's no need for a movie called The Lion in Winter.
Right, based on a stage play. The interesting thing for me about that too is that we certainly understand more now than they did then about what produces the sex of offspring.
Yes.
And we understand that it's the father that has that role.
Yeah, they didn't quite get that.
But, one of the interesting things to me whenever I look at these situations is, under different sets of circumstances, did something different happen? I mean, one of the things, for example, that we see in other instances where there's not a male heir that's produced, it appears to be that's just the function of who the king is, not realizing that he just always, doesn't matter who the woman is, for the most part, he's almost always going to produce daughters.
A girl.
Yeah, and so, then, of course, the blame was placed upon, as if it were somehow the responsibility of the queen or the, whoever is giving birth to do this. But, but I'm about to say the reason I gave that background may not be fair is that, you might think of the sex of the baby as a coin flip to some degree, roughly. It's not really a 50-50 chance. It's something like 53-47 or something like that. Yeah. But if you consider those to be, all things being equal, in a lot of instances, a coin flip, Louis later, when he remarries, has a son. So that wasn't on Louis's inability to produce a son. Right. It just so happened that after 2 births, he's only got daughters. Well, that's in a 50-50 scenario, there's a 25% chance that's where you're going to be 1 time out of 4. But again, if you just flip the coin, flip one of those a different direction, that's what changes all of this. Right. And so, that's a big thing, but that's a small thing. I mean, it's literally, in the way that really works, it's biology. It's whether an X chromosome sperm or a Y chromosome sperm made it to the egg, right? Which is so infinitesimally small. That's the pivot of some of these forks in time, is that the sex of an heir to a royal household obviously makes a big difference. And what causes that doesn't matter whether you're the king, it doesn't matter whether you're the poorest peasant. That's purely a function of biology and to some degree, for all intents and purposes, a little bit of chemistry and a coin flip.
Yeah, it's funny when you said, it's kind of just chance. We talked about the Magna Carta. We actually got to see the Magna Carta when it came to Euston. It came to one of the museums here, and they had one of the interactive things that you could do. Is basically it was like, what would your job be if you lived during the 1200s? And I think it was you were standing behind this little kid, and he was getting frustrated because he was like, no matter what I do, I'm always a peasant. Like, it was questions like, can you read, can you write, can you do this, can you do that? And no matter what he picked, he always ended up being peasant. And then I think you did it, and you like basically did everything that was opposite, and somehow you got like king or something.
Right.
So it's totally kind of arbitrary, things like that, sex of an heir, sex of a baby. Does that baby survive? They're these little bitty things, but they make a huge ripple effect in history overall.
Right. And that is, again, the exercise that we do on A Fork in Time, is that the deflections of history, is I think I've used that term before, if not, it's how I think of it, are sometimes very major deflections.
Yep.
Sometimes they're minor deflections. Sometimes, as we talked about a couple episodes ago, if Annie Oakley is a couple of inches to the right or left,
She's Mr. Mark just a little.
yeah, then so sometimes it's small things. History can be a game of inches, so to speak, or in this case, a game of whatever the size of what goes on inside a fertilization of an egg inside of a human. That's not inches. That's at the microscopic level.
That's atoms.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think that's an interesting thing here, and just understanding that sometimes the fork is not the obvious thing in this terms of who won or who did Eleanor's father choose to marry her to by his choice. This literally was the case of him choosing the protector and the King of France, the choice then made there. But the ultimate outcome of all this for France and England for centuries to come, and maybe even very different overall, is the result of the sex of the first child from that union, because that changed, again, this powerful figure. And there's no doubt that when you look at the powerful forces, female forces of history, Eleanor makes the short list. She's
up there.
She's on the quote-unquote Mount Rushmore to Americans of almost anyone you would want to name. Catherine the Great immediately jumps to mind for me for others. There are certainly others that exist, but she's on that short list, particularly because of who she is and when she is.
Yep.
So on that note, we'll go ahead and bring at least today's episode to a close. I have a strong suspicion at some point, if A Fork in Time continues to run for any length of period of time, we'll be back to explore either this particular topic or a closely related topic again, partly because it's in English history, but also partly because it is a pivotal point in English history and what goes on from there. So we thank you for joining us today here on A Fork in Time. As we close out, just want to remind you to visit our website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. As we say all the time, there's all kinds of ways you can interact with us there. Give us suggestions, give us feedback, listen to past episodes, all the things that are there. If you feel so inclined and are able to, there's the link there to our Patreon page where you can actually provide some financial support to the podcast if you want to. Helps us defray the cost, helps us make sure that we're using newer equipment and other ways of doing things that make the podcast better and better as we move forward. But again, as we always like to tell you, most importantly, we want to say thank you for your time and your attention. And as we've mentioned before, particularly during this time as we're dealing with a global health situation, the pandemic, the coronavirus and COVID-19, we hope that all of you are safe and are protected during this period of time. Anything you want to say before we close, Lex?
I just want to kind of echo that. We want to make sure that everyone is staying safe and staying healthy. We want to hear from you. I know that I'm getting a little bit stir crazy just sitting in the house, and I know several other people who are. So if that applies to you, get in touch with us. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from you to know that you're well, but we want to hear what you're doing, how you're kind of coping with the pandemic and the different stipulations and kind of regulations that have been put in place. So yeah, reach out to us. But yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep listening.
Yeah, in fact, you'll see on the website that we've created a link on the main page that I'm calling the COVID check-in. So if you click there,
I like that alliteration.
yeah, it's somebody told me we're sometimes too clever with the title of our episodes. I don't know if we're clever enough. Sometimes we think we're being clever, maybe when we're not. But just check in. That's the whole idea, is just so that we know what's going on, and we just want to hear back from the community there. So once again, we thank you for your time. We thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time, and we hope to have you next time when we come back and explore another fork in history. Be safe and healthy.
Come back and see us as we explore another fork in time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.